It's hard to understand the development of music after 1750 without knowing about classical forms. The purpose of this video is to explain the way the classical symphony was structured. We'll begin with a general overview of the sonata cycle and then look at specifically at ternary form. Before we go on though, I'd like to get you to think about what form is. What does form mean? Well, form is the purposeful organization of the artist's materials. In music, it's the general shape or structure of a composition. In other words, it's how the piece is put together. For most of us, we're pretty visual and we can see form in art and sculpture, design. But in music, it's a little bit harder because you have to listen to an entire piece to be able to hear how something is put together. And that's why recordings are really important, that you can listen to a piece over and over again and start to hear that. To hear form, it requires musical memory. Classical forms give us not only the basis for most of the music written between 1770 and 1820, but their influence reaches way beyond the classical period. For example, to appreciate how Beethoven stretched and adapted them to suit his expressive purposes, you need to know the conventions of classical forms. Romantic composers, those are the composers that followed the classical period, they would either use or reject classical forms, but those who rejected them still borrowed many of their features. Even in the 20th century, classical forms were frequently used. So, in other words, these forms don't go away. There were many different formats that were used in the early symphonies, but by about 1770, this four-movement plan emerged. This is called the sonata cycle. It doesn't say that in our book, but the sonata cycle is the name that refers to the large-scale structure of a symphony. Actually, not just the symphony, but other instrumental genres like sonatas and string quartets and serenades and so on. This slide shows you that the symphony has four movements. The first movement is moderate to fast. There's an optional slow introduction. The second movement would be the slowest and is usually the most lyrical and song-like. The third movement, whose structure is actually not new because we've seen this last week and the week before, the third movement was the minuet and trio, also just called the minuet, was a dance-inspired movement. And the last movement was usually the fastest in tempo. The last movement was often light and tuneful and brilliant. On page 187 in your book, you'll find this very helpful chart. I'd basically like you guys to memorize this chart. Not only does it show you the tempos for the individual movements, but it also shows you their structures or forms. Wright starts out with introducing the third movement structure as, I think because it's easiest to grasp, and also because it serves as a really good introduction to the more complicated sonata allegro form, the form for the first movement. So let's start out by taking a look at the minuet and trio third movement. This started out, of course, as a dance from the Baroque period, but by the time we get to the classical period, this wasn't to be danced to. It evolved into a type of piece. This slide shows you that the third movement, the minuet trio, was a ternary form. At the bottom you see that the minuet is labeled capital A and is made up of little phrases that are represented by little letters of the alphabet with these little dots that surround them. Those mean repeat. So the minuet is made up of a couple little phrases. The contrasting B section, the trio, was made up of little c and little d, and again these were repeated. Originally the trios were for three parts, but by the time we get to the classical era, it didn't really matter how many people played. You will notice a contrast though, going from the A section to the B section. Usually there's a different kind of style, and oftentimes it goes from the tonic key to the dominant key. After the trio, or the B section, there's what's called a da capo, and that literally means go back to the beginning. So the A, the capital A, the minuet returns, and normally when it returns, it's played without repeat. So anyway, that's the standardized format. Go, when you're done listening to this, listen to our book example, A Little Night Music, Eine kleine Nachtmusik. This is from Mozart's Serenade. This is the third movement. Also, as an example of ternary form for the third movement in a classical piece, you have the third movement from Haydn's Symphony No. 94. Usually in the classical period, the third movement of a symphony or string quartet was a graceful minuet and trio. Haydn, though, and his pupil Beethoven wanted to infuse this third movement sometimes with more life and energy. So they often wrote a faster piece, called it a scherzo, which means joke. Here's an example of Beethoven's scherzo from his Ninth Symphony. We'll to listen to a little bit of it. Well, I don't want to infringe on any copyright law, so I just played a little bit of that. I will include this week's learning module a link to that performance of the Ninth Symphony. I don't know if you could tell, it's actually is in three. He wrote it out in three, but it's just played so fast that it's usually conducted in one, like you just heard. The form is actually the same as that of a minuet. It's in ABA, but this example by Beethoven is quite a bit longer. It's yeah, it's over 12 minutes long. Okay, it's not part of your listening, but I hope you do check it out because it's one of the great pieces.